Okay, good morning, everyone. Let's get started. Yes, good morning. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining us here in person. I know we have a lot of you joining us virtually. We at the Dialogue, we're thrilled to be co-hosting this event with LAPOP, Vanderbilt University, and also with USAID. And today we're here for the launch of the much-awaited 2023 America's Barometer report. I have been waiting very eagerly for this. So we are so lucky to have with us Liz Zechmeister and Noam Lupu, both professors at Vanderbilt University. And well, Liz is actually the Cornelius Vanderbilt Professor of Political Science, and Noam is an associate professor of political science. And they are the director and co-director of the LAPOP Public Opinion Lab. So I just want to say that in my current role here at the Dialogue, but also during my years as a public service, and particularly as when I was a college professor, I relied heavily on the America's Barometer for my research and really to gain a deeper understanding of the opportunities, but also the challenges facing our hemisphere, particularly when it comes to democracy. And Liz knows this very well because I know there have been many times when I've emailed you asking for data with a very yeah, it's been super helpful to my research. And I know we'll get to hear from USAID about how important it is when it comes to policy making. So we are also so fortunate this morning to be joined by Deborah Ulmer, Regional Director of the Latin America and Caribbean Program at National Democratic Institute, NDI, who will provide great commentary on democracy. We've also got Renata Segura, who is Deputy Program Director for Latin America and the Caribbean at International Crisis Group and an expert on security and democracy, and Manuel Orozco, Director of the Migration, Remittances, and Development Program here at the Inter-American Dialogue. And we'll get to hear about migration trends, and we're fortunate to have Manuel here to comment on that. We are honored to have with us USAID, an Assistant Administrator for the Bureau of Latin America and the Caribbean, Marcela Escobari, with us, and she's going to really help us frame the discussion. And Marcela, for those of you who don't know her, is a real thought leader when it comes to inclusive development and also good governance, which, as Liz and Noam will explain, are the two key variables when it comes to commitment to democracy. Marcela spearheads USAID's effort to advance collaborative regional response to the historic and hemisphere-wide migration crisis. Working with US government and regional partners under Marcela's leadership, USAID is driving forward a three-pronged strategy focused on addressing root causes, expanding legal pathways, and promoting the integration of migrants into host communities. And here I just want to highlight how important that is, because one of the findings we'll hear about is that there's growing xenophobia or anti-migrant sentiment, and especially when it comes to Venezuelan refugees. Marcela is also expanding the Bureau's effort to help democratic reformers in the region to deliver for their citizens in the face of economic challenges. And we all know that satisfaction with democracy is, I think, well, we'll know today, 41%. And a lot of that is because this perception that democracy doesn't deliver. Marcela previously served in the Obama administration, and prior to serving in government, she was the executive director at Harvard's Center for International Development. With that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Marcela.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and good morning, everyone. So I want to start by thanking LAPOP, its host, Vanderbilt University, and the Inter-American Dialogue for getting all of us together today. And I'm so glad to be here for the launch of the 2023 Barometer, America's Barometer. I wanted to make it sound like the Oscars, but you know, I need to practice. So we have been there from the start, and it's great to celebrate our 19th year of working together. And I was trying to think about what actually happened in 2004 that was memorable, And all I could come up with is that the Red Sox won the World Series after almost 100 years, which I was there, not meaningful for many others, but you have had a more successful winning streak than they have. That's all I can say. Well, there are many reasons that we find this exercise extremely useful, both for the region and for our work. First and foremost, because it's measuring something really hard and yet really important, which is this perception of democracy and trust in institutions. And the reason it's hard, there's lots of reasons it's hard, but it's because people often conflate their feelings about the system that they live in with the idea of democracy. So if the system is not delivering for them, not improving their livelihoods, not delivering services that they can rely on, then they just, disapprove of democracy. But parts of LAPOP's methods really allow us to go deeper into what affects those sentiments by providing this longitudinal data that allows us to track the evolution in beliefs in a given country over administrations and over change in policies. And second, another thing that I think is very specific about what you do is that you're not just measuring, when you can, perceptions, but tying perceptions to very specific experiences. So you're not only measuring trust in the courts, but also whether that trust is affected if someone has had to pay a bribe to the courts. So on a complex issue and as consequential as the belief in democracy, this data is helping us determine whether and if we're making progress. And, as many in the Bureau and in the region and who work on these issues know, like proving to citizens that liberal democracy, rule of law, and market-based economies can deliver on their most basic needs is not only hard, but probably one of the most important challenges that we're facing today. Latin America went through its period of democratization, and it was pretty dramatic in the 80s. But that actually did not translate into a robust middle class. Inequitable and lackluster growth left citizens, frustrated and demanding better. And the inability of governments and sometimes unwillingness to respond adequately has led to political instability in the region. And some of what we see today in many election cycles, where people are just willing to vote for change, whether that change brings authoritarianism or populism. So amidst this kind of unmet promise and the many other challenges that the region confronts, I think the Americas Barometer allows us to keep democracy front and center in our priorities. I also find it super valuable that you make this data set fully available to the public, because you're providing an incredible asset to researchers around the globe. I mean, we've seen analysis that correlates the support of democracy with economic growth and the impact of specific policies. But we're also seeing analysis describing these counterintuitive narratives based on this research, like what we saw in Chile, for example, where economic growth and a rising middle class came not with the expected increase in satisfaction with government, but with the increased demands of the system. So people are using this survey in many different ways to understand the dynamics in the region, and including how to predict how discontent is going to show up in election cycles. Let me give you a couple examples of how we at USAID use the Americas Barometer to inform our work. So in Peru, for example, this is not going to surprise anyone, the Peruvians' perceptions on different branches of government is quite low and very specific in different places. And we've actually used it to strengthen our protections for the citizenry that often deeply distrust courts, police, human rights bodies, the very institutions that are supposed to be protecting them. Similarly, on migration, I mean, we know that youth and violence are associated with intentions to migrate, but we've been able to use LAPOP in Honduras to really, get data that reinforces that connection, that shows not only that the young are likelier to migrate, but those that have been that have suffered a crime not only have an intention to migrate, but have taken action toward that route. And that has really helped us to focus in that intersection of community security with opportunity for youth. And I know that national governments are also using your work. Ecuador has used LAPOP in the shaping of their national strategy for anti-corruption. The last thing I wanted to mention that I really want to congratulate you for, and I find and our team finds extremely important, is not just producing this very valuable asset, but your dedication in pushing the field of data collection and use forward. You have improved the local capacity for rigorous survey work around really complex issues. And in Mexico, the partnership that you had with Data OPM in building and doing these surveys allowed them to then do other complex surveys for major projects with the World Justice Project and others. And you've also brought to the fore very sensitive topics and put them on the table for researchers across the hemisphere. We saw that with your recent publication on best practices for asking questions about gender identity, and how to approach it in a way that can get meaningful answers, particularly in a region that is not used to confronting these issues. And lastly, I think your methods have ensured that we are listening to voices, to diverse voices and the voices of the future. I found particularly interesting the finding, even if not maybe dramatically surprising, that young adults are more committed to democracy than their predecessors, which we hope it shows leaders the importance of paying attention to the changing perceptions among the next generation, but also that this information can give politicians the courage to drive reform on social issues that for a long time have seemed quite intractable in the region. So I look forward to continuing to use the Americas Barometer to inform our work around the hemisphere. And we are very deeply grateful for our partnership. So I'm very much looking forward to be part of the audience and listening and hearing what the data says this year. And I know I'm going to join the chorus of voices that will congratulate you for another great year and successful regional survey. Thank you so much.
So we're going to turn it over now to the director of the Americas Barometer.
Thanks so much. And thank you for those wonderful comments. They really underscore for me what a deeply collaborative project this is. This is a project that rests on collaboration within our group back at Vanderbilt, with the students there, with a former student who I'm calling out who's in the back of the room here, where pedagogy is really at the root of what we do. A lot of capacity building across the region. We work with partners in every country, and then we have a deep set of collaborations here in DC centered around USAID, and we're so grateful to you for your support. So thank you so much for those wonderful comments. It's a real pleasure to be here today to make public the release of our 2023 report on the region. This report is the Pulse of Democracy in the Americas. It takes stock of what is going on with democracy from the perspective of citizens across the region. And it's our 10th round of the Americas Barometer. So we're super proud to be here and happy to be able to launch this report. And I should note that the report and all the data sets are now live on our website. So analyze away. I want to thank the Dialogue, Rebecca and her team for hosting us here. We really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. And I want to thank USAID and Vanderbilt for their core support for the project, and our team at LAPOP Central for their expertise and long hours, which are driving factors for any success that our project has. Our presentation today is going to cover just 3 topics from a pretty high level, 3 topics of many that are covered in the report and that are available for analysis in the data sets. And so if you advance the slide, we'll see those 3 topics here. And I'll just move straight in and say that a few words first about the America's Barometer project. So the America's Barometer consists of nationally representative surveys in countries across the Western Hemisphere. By nationally representative, I mean that we conduct interviews in urban areas, but also in rural areas. And so the data can be analyzed at the level of the country. They can be analyzed at the level of the region, and you'll see regional averages in the presentation today. They can also be analyzed at levels below the country. So by urban and rural place of residence, by major geographic areas, and by subgroups within countries. So lots of potential uses of the data because of that nationally representative sample design. The samples, when they're designed to be nationally representative, are also developed and implemented in a very standardized way, so that when you make comparisons across countries, you can be certain that you're comparing apples to apples and not apples to oranges. So that differences that we see in the data set across countries and across time can be attributed to real changes or differences in public opinion and related attitudes and experiences. The data from the America's Barometer also creates a time series so that we can take stock of what's been happening in the region over time. And as Marcella noted, this is a project that has been in the field for 20 years now, from 2004 to present day. So we have 20 years of data, 10 rounds, since it's a project that covers the region every 2 years. The third thing I'll note about the America's Barometer, next slide, is that the 2023 America's Barometer contains data from 26 countries, most of which you'll see represented in the report and in the comments that we have today, and then some additional countries available for you to explore in the data that are available on our website. So let's move to some of our top line findings. Our analyses from the 2023 America's Barometer have allowed us to see quite clearly that the region has settled into a new equilibrium when it comes to attitudes towards democracy and intentions to emigrate. I'm going to show you some of those patterns and you'll see what I mean. Here we have a slide that is depicting the public's support and satisfaction with democracy over time for the region as a whole. So the purple line represents the regional average support for democracy from 2004 to present day, and the green line represents the regional average satisfaction with democracy from 2004 to present day. And what you can see in those lines is that over time, we moved from a steady state that was comparatively higher to a steady state that is now comparatively lower, with that drop happening around the period 2014, 2015. You see the region sort of settled into a new equilibrium. Next slide. This slide here breaks things down by country. Now there's a lot of data here. There's a lot of data in the data sets and in the reports. We're not going to spend too much time, but just so you can, I'll stand here just for a minute on this slide so you can see some of what's been happening in the recent time period with respect to support for democracy. So when we look just at the past couple of years, we see that support for democracy has remained mostly stable, with a few exceptions, in most LAC countries. So the green dot there represents the percentage of the public in the country that expressed support for democracy in 2021, and the purple dot represents the percentage of the public that expresses support for democracy in 2023. So I'll just note again, mostly stability in the recent time period, with a few exceptions, and I'll point out Bolivia, the country there, BO, moving from 61% to 51%, so 10 percentage point drop in support for democracy in the recent time period. And Ecuador likewise experiencing a similar drop, where you see the country moving from 63% to 51% in this recent time period. You can also use that type of ranking or that type of analysis to look at how countries rank in general. And so if we look back at that slide, you'll see that countries such as Uruguay and Costa Rica, Chile are at the top of the chart, and countries like Suriname, Honduras, and Guatemala are at the bottom of the ranking when it comes to public support for sentiment in favor of democracy. We can also look at people's attitudes towards democracy, not by asking them about democracy per se, but about core values that we associate with a strong democracy. In this case, rule of law. So here we're asking people whether or not, in order to deliver on promises to the people, it's acceptable or justifiable for politicians to act outside the law. And we're showing you the percentage of people in each country in the 2023 America's Barometer who agree with that notion that to deliver on promises, it's justifiable for politicians to skirt the law. So you can see that if you sort of look across the region, you'll see that on average, about 2 out of every 5 persons says, yes, it's acceptable to break the law in order to deliver on promises. And that sentiment is particularly high in certain countries where we see over 50% of the public expressing some tolerance for that type of extra legal maneuvering. Countries like El Salvador, the Dominican Republic, Panama, Honduras. Next slide. We also in the data sets, in the questionnaires, in the report, take a look at intentions to emigrate. And here we also see this evidence of sort of new equilibrium. You'll see around the same time period that I highlighted before, there's an uptick in intentions to emigrate expressed across the region on average. So we saw previously numbers hovering around 20%, and then in 2016-17, the regional average pops up 10 percentage points to 30, and it's been sort of moving around that data point in the years since then. If we look at this data through another lens, as we do in the report, we can also make some steps towards sorting out the difference between having an aspiration to leave and having taken some concrete steps to do so. So that's something that we do in the report and that you can also do in using the data and take a look at that in more detail. When we look at those differences between people having an aspiration to leave and having taken more concrete steps to leave, we do see some differences across countries. So for example, if you turn to the next slide, we'll see that in Haiti at the top of the chart here, 79% of people express an aspiration to leave, but only a small percentage of that group of 79% have actually taken concrete steps to make that departure happen. Whereas in Nicaragua, you'll see the green dot represents a few years ago in the 2018-19 survey, and the purple dot represents this current time period. In Nicaragua, towards the top of the chart, about 3 lines down, we see a significant jump in aspirations to leave. And when we analyze those data, we also see that a sizable portion of that 50% of the public has taken concrete steps to try to leave. So we can look at aspirations with the data. We can also look at those who have aspirations and segment them according to whether or not they have or have not taken concrete steps in order to leave. Both give us some sense of what we might expect in terms of migration flows, and we can use the data in different ways. Both, interestingly, are predicted by similar factors. So they allow us to look at these cross-national differences, but they also tell us that some of the same factors that predict aspirations to leave also motivate people to take steps to leave. And those factors relate to good governance and inclusive growth. So we see that experiences with crime victimization, experiences with income loss, food insecurity, these are factors that motivate people to aspire to leave and to take steps to leave. We also see that those factors are connected to people's trust in political institutions, and in turn then reflected in their support for democracy and their satisfaction with democracy. So I'm going to stop here and turn it over to Noam, who's going to talk a little bit more about how the region has been performing when it comes to these 2 dimensions, good governance and inclusive growth, and then say a little bit more about what are the consequences of some of the sort of failings and mixed records in that regard.
All right, thanks, Liz. And let me just add to Liz's my thanks to Marcella and USAID and also to Rebecca and the dialogue for hosting us. So if we go to the next slide, as Liz mentioned, we think in the report, we talk about sort of different paths to support for democracy in the public. And so one challenge in generating support for democracy is building institutional trust. And institutional trust comes in part from delivering on the promises of democracy. So one of the promises of democracy is providing reasonable economic conditions, or conditions for people to prosper economically. What you can see here is that pessimism about economic growth or sort of economic conditions is at an all-time high in the region. That is, perceptions of economic performance are at an all-time low. And we've seen this trend effectively sort of since the end of the commodities boom in the region, sort of increasing pessimism about economic conditions. Another sort of manifestation of this, maybe one that's a little bit even more striking than the perceptions of overall economic conditions, is we've been asking questions about food insecurity. And again, food insecurity has increased in the region in some dramatic ways. So here the comparison is to 2012. So in the green, those are 2012, and the purple dots here are 2023. And again, there's, as Liz mentioned, there's a lot of different countries and a lot of things going on here. But what you can see, I think, pretty clearly is that in all but 2 countries in the region, food insecurity increased quite dramatically. And of course, most dramatically, maybe not so surprising, is Haiti, that went from 42% saying that they had gone without food sometime in the last 3 months to 78% saying that they had gone without food. The 78 number is sort of striking because 79% say that they want to leave, right, that they intend to emigrate. And it's not a perfect correlation, but those are quite close. Yeah, so across the region, you can see sort of increases here, even in countries where you might not have expected such a huge increase. Even if we look at Chile at the bottom, the lowest level of food insecurity, but still an increase from 2012. Crime, as we know, is also an increasing issue in the region. Region-wide crime victimization increased in 2023 relative to what we saw in the last round in 2021, a sort of slight increase, but we've seen this kind of increase from roughly 19–20% a decade ago to sort of higher levels, closer to 25%. Saying that they had been the victim of a crime in the prior 12 months. So this is just in a 1-year period. Nearly a quarter of Latin Americans are telling us that they had been victims of crime. This is really quite a widespread issue that obviously erodes trust in institutions and motivates people to want to emigrate. Again, there's variation across the region. Again, you can see that overall there's an increase from 2012 to 2023 in just about every country, but with highest levels in at the top here, Nicaragua, Argentina, and Ecuador. Right, so cases where trust and support for democracy has been eroding quite a bit more than in other parts of the region. In fact, Argentina is among the sort of highest declines in support for democracy from the beginning of the barometer in 2004 to today. So what are the sort of paths forward in how we think about support for democracy going forward? So we talk in the report about sort of 2 paths to generating trust in institutions and support for democracy, or at least trust in some sort of democratic institutions. One is through good governance, right? Providing the kinds of, delivering on the kinds of expectations that citizens have of their governments. The other path, though, and it's worth mentioning and thinking about, particularly when we think about public opinion, is through populism, right? A leader who is believed to be the sort of the savior for the people, who will come in and rather than working through institutions and accountability, deliver on the promises of government as an individual, right? By centralizing power, by actually sort of delivering on their own. And we know, of course, that there are problems with the populist path to building institutional trust, as we'll see. So, of course, there's a relationship between trust in the institutions of government and the overall support for democracy as sort of a more principled support for democracy. And here you're seeing that those who have less trust in democratic institutions also have lower levels of support for democracy, right? So if we can build that institutional trust, we would also build support for democracy more generally. That said, trust in those democratic institutions is low across the region, and low even in places that you might not expect. Here, we're just looking at one of those institutions. The report and the survey ask about a whole host of democratic institutions and other political institutions. Here, we're just looking at trust in elections, which you can see is highest, maybe unsurprisingly, in Costa Rica and Uruguay, although we're still talking about 2/3 of citizens in those countries saying that they have a high level of trust, but also in El Salvador and Mexico, right, where institutions have eroded in some sense, but there is sort of still public trust in elections. Here's an indication of what we think of as one of the costs or the problems with the populist path to building that kind of institutional trust. And so here we're looking at focusing in on survey respondents who tell us that they don't approve of the president. So these are critics of the current government. And then we ask whether they think that there is enough freedom of speech, whether they feel like they can express their opinions freely in their society. And what you can see here is the highest levels of concern about freedom of speech among critics of the government are in Nicaragua and El Salvador, right? And large increases in both of those countries from 2016-17 when we asked these questions to this year. Whereas if you look at the bottom of the chart here, Argentina and Chile, much lower levels of concern about the freedom to express their critical views of the government. Right? So this is one of the indications that there's a real cost. So the populist path generates support for democracy, but also generates lots of concerns among government critics. We wanted to also highlight, and Marcela mentioned this already, and this is one of the pieces that's highlighted in the report, and there's a lot that can be said about this. But there is a narrative about youth in the region and more generally about youth and youth commitment to democracy. That in general, we think that young people are less committed to democracy, and this is sort of is presented as alarming for the future of democracy in the region and elsewhere, because of course young people are the middle-aged people of the future, and older cohorts will eventually sort of exit the scene, right? So, so we imagine that as these youth become older, we will end up seeing sort of declining support for democracy on average in the region. And the problem with that, and that is consistent with the kinds of patterns that we tend to see, which is support for democracy is lower among younger people than among older people. The problem with sort of extrapolating from that tendency is that it misses the possibility, and in fact it turns out to be true, that as people age, they also become more supportive of democracy, right? And so we're not really comparing apples to apples when we just compare younger people to older people today. But one of the benefits of the AmericasBarometer and having been able to do it for the last 20 years for this 10th round is that we can actually compare youth today, 18-year-olds today, to 18-year-olds 20 years ago. And so we can actually sort of compare cohorts rather than sort of comparing across age groups today. And once you do that kind of analysis, it actually turns out that young people today are actually more committed to democracy than young people were 20 years ago in the region. And so here there's sort of a number of indicators of that, the support for democracy question that you've seen, Also, other questions about whether or not a military coup would be justified under difficult conditions, trust in elections, whether or not government responds to people on all of those dimensions, and the sort of the purple dot is the young generation today, the post-transitions generation. On all of those scores, what you can see is a sort of a higher level of commitment to democracy among young people than their predecessors when they were young, right? And that we think is the right way to think about that comparison. So that's what we have as sort of a high level of, there's a lot more information in the reports. I hope that we can get into some of those other details in the discussion. And thank you all again. And thanks again to our commentators as well. And looking forward to a great discussion.
Thank you so much, Liz and Noam. So why don't we have the other panelists join us up front? And while we're doing that, I just wanted to, there are two things that really struck me in the presentation. And one is the fact that there are these two pathways to trust, which is really kind of scary in my view, that you can have the kind of the good governance path, but also the populist kind of a, you know, we're seeing this a lot in the region, which can also, you know, build trust. And something maybe we can talk about in the discussion is, you know, what is the answer when we have leaders like Bukele, who takes advantage of this trust to then further undermine institutions that are originally designed to curb their authority. And in the case of El Salvador, to give the security forces, you know, these powers that are clearly outside the bounds of the rule of law. And I think, I love the quote in the report, trust may be critical, but blind trust can be catastrophic for democracy. And the second point is what Noam ended on, is this really surprised me about the young generation. And I think that is something to be very optimistic about, because my assumption was that the generation that right after the beginning of the third wave of democratic transitions, because of their experience, would have a much higher level of support for democracy. And I was talking to Ruben, who we did a showing of Argentina 1985 with Amazon, and Luis Moreno Ocampo joined us, the prosecutor during the military trials. And he also shared that assumption. He said one of the reasons that he's so proud of this movie is because the younger generations will now see kind of what their parents and grandparents went through. So now we're at the second part. We've got three great panelists who I introduced earlier, but I've asked, of course, Liz and Noam to stay on, because they are not just data collectors, they are both renowned political scientists who use their data to develop theory. So I'd ask each panelist to speak for 5 minutes, and then we'll open it up to discussion. And just, sorry, one more point, if you'll indulge me, is I think so Liz mentioned pedagogy, and it was a reminder to me that all of this tremendous work has taken place in a university setting. And as someone who spent 20 years in academia, one of my greatest frustrations was there's this huge gap between academia and public policy. But here I think we have a concrete example of the importance of bridging that divide. So I'm also very, very grateful to you on that front. Thank you. So why don't we turn it over right away to Deborah. Deborah Ulmer, NDI.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for being here. And thank you, Rebecca, and the Inter-American Dialogue, and to the LAPOP Lab at Vanderbilt University for asking us to comment, and for this opportunity to really take a deeper dive into your analysis. As a democracy practitioner for the past 25 years with NDI, I've really relied on LAPOP's analysis for my own political analysis, but also to help guide our programming and to provide evidence-based policymaking. So NDI, we work to promote good governance and help democracy deliver on issues such as citizen security, integrity, accountability and transparency, dialogue on political reform, and combating false information. So NDI's work will inform my observations this morning. One of the main findings, Noam and Liz, that you pointed out from the survey is that public support for democracy and attitudes conducive to stable democracy are lower in Latin America and the Caribbean than they were 20 years ago. So since then, there has been numerous challenges, as Marcela highlighted, and that's a rise in authoritarianism, an increased preference for populist leaders who dismantle democratic institutions in their wake, efforts to delegitimize election results by corrupt governments that bend the rules of the game in their favor and abuse power to benefit themselves, a deepening use of military and states of emergency to deal with gangs and organized crime, a prevalence of false information and illiberal influences like China and Russia, the wielding of judicial systems against government critics, and migration due to crime, poverty, climate change, and other vulnerabilities, resulting in humanitarian crises in the region. The survey also documented erosion in support for democracy in nearly all Latin American countries, with the exception of Costa Rica and El Salvador. Dissatisfaction and fatigue from long-standing problems of crime, corruption, and economic inequality, as well as polarizing rhetoric against the political status quo, have contributed to the rise of political leaders that are populist. According to the survey, El Salvador is at a crossroads with a sizable proportion of the population committed to democracy. Yet, as you point out, there is strong public opinion support for Nayib Bukele's policies to combat crime. The survey confirms Bukele's popularity amongst the Salvadorans, but indeed, Bukele is very popular in the Americas. His solution to long-standing problem of violent crime, sweeping arrests, and summary incarceration at the expense of rule of law, rights, and checks and balances have proved popular to imitate. The LAPOP survey highlights that there is a slow-burning crisis of confidence in democracy. In recent years, elected officials have eroded confidence in democracy using state institutions to legitimize restrictions on rights, civic space, and electoral competition. The presidential elections in Guatemala renewed hope for reversing democratic backsliding with the landslide victory of anti-corruption champion Bernardo Arévalo. Nevertheless, President-elect Arévalo has denounced a coup by institutions that should guarantee the rule of law, including the Attorney General, the Special Prosecutor's Office Against Impunity, a judge, and the Governing Board of Congress, which have instead ignored the will of the voters, revoked the legal status of Arévalo's party, the Semilla movement, and are attempting now to prevent a peaceful democratic transition. Furthermore, the survey indicates that 1 in 2 adults support democracy fewer than 1 in 2 adults support democracy in Guatemala and Honduras. And in Honduras, they're facing perhaps the most severe governability crisis since the 2009 coup d'etat, which is undermining citizens' confidence in the rule of law and democratic institutions. Over the last year, the National Congress has reached a legislative deadlock, as no political party holds a majority and deputies have been unable to reach a consensus to elect their Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General. These are positions that are critical to the success of combating corruption and impunity from the law. As a result, the pro-Castro government president of the legislature invoked a constitutional clause to establish a legislative commission of 9 ruling party members to name interim officials. With no dialogue and consensus within Congress, there is concern about democratic backsliding in Honduras. You just pointed out, Noam, that the survey spotlights that over the last 5 years, the most significant widespread declines in freedom of speech have occurred in El Salvador and Nicaragua. Nicaragua is currently rated as the lowest ranked country in the terms of freedoms of speech. This is due to the Ortega Murillo's regime cracking down on opposition and dissent, including retaliations against members of the church, independent media, and of all things, most recently on Miss Nicaragua, now Miss Universe. The ongoing expulsion, arbitrary detention of citizenship, and confiscation of property of hundreds of Nicaraguan critics is highlighting the seamlessly bottomless repression in the country. And finally, according to the LAPOP survey, a democracy that fails to perform up to its expectation risks losing its legitimacy. Marcela, you highlighted Peru. This is critical in a place like Peru, where democracy is on the line. It suffered a crisis of representation in political parties with 6 presidents over the past 5 years. Ongoing instability in Peru peaked when former President Pedro Castillo unsuccessfully attempted to dissolve Congress in December 2022 to avoid impeachment, leading to his jailing and Vice President Dina Boluarte assuming the president. She's proposed holding early elections, but the Congress has consistently voted against this option to preserve their own seats. Public disapproval ratings of both the executive and the legislature are extremely high, and as is the public perception that the country is not governed for the benefit of its citizens. And 2 years after the assassination of the late Haitian President Moïse, interim Prime Minister Ariel Henry and opposition political and civic leaders have yet to agree on a transition plan and new elections. At present, with the terms of office long expired, there are no popularly elected leaders at any level remaining in Haiti. This political stalemate, the lack of legitimacy of the government and its institutions, and undermanned and outgunned security forces have enabled dozens of criminal gangs to expand their reach and their illicit activities. In the meantime, an effort is underway to set up an internationally supported security force led by Kenya that can assist the Haitian police in curbing gang violence and restoring peace so that there can be some conditions for elections. Congratulations on an excellent report, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, and thanks so much for having me. I think Deborah has mentioned some of the points that I was thinking about. I mean, for me as a comparative political scientist and as the work that we do at Crisis Group, which is very field-based, the barometer is really like an incredible amount of questions, right? Because we're always wondering why. Why are people speaking like that? So I thought that for today, I would look at some of the cases where we work in Crisis Group, where we've been paying attention to, and particularly look at the impact that I know you guys speak about crime. I think we can have a conversation about how much it's about conflict and security overall rather than just exclusively crime. But I think even though it's not, the questions aren't necessarily posed in that way, there's clearly some connections between the way in which conflict and security overall is affecting the perceptions of democracy. And I think, as Deborah was mentioning, El Salvador is clearly not perhaps puzzling, but I think it's the case that really invites us to really think what we mean by democracy or what Salvadorians are thinking by democracy. I think the international community, as included, we've made this mistake of really judging Salvadorians for supporting Bukele without sufficiently acknowledge the level of improvement of the lives of the majority of the people that live there. And so looking at the barometer, you really have to wonder if they're really just using the word democracy for a proxy for Bukele or the current administration, or they're just saying democracy is a system that delivers to me in the most basic thing that it is the possibility that my life is not going to be taken while I go to the market. So obviously, the support for Bukele has to come, and for democracy in El Salvador has to come from the incredible changes in security that we've seen in the last 2 years, despite the fact that, as Deborah was saying, we have seen very verifiable weaknessing of institutions. I was particularly shocked, for example, by the level of support in the courts, when we know that the court systems have been eroded by this administration. And yet, people in El Salvador are very clear about their worries about freedom of speech. Clearly, also the question about outside the law. But I think El Salvador does bring us to a point in which we have to wonder how much providing people with that basic right that is security is really shaping their understanding of what democracy means for them. And in sort of the opposite way of the coin, although unfortunately we don't have all of the questions for Haiti, Haiti is clearly the closest thing that we have to a failed state in the Americas. And so, I mean, I would imagine if the question on police support or if the executive had been posed, it would have been dismal. The 79% migration intent, even if not realistic, just speaks volumes about what is happening in this country. And then I wanted to just turn briefly to three cases that I thought were interesting. Well, Ecuador clearly is another one of those cases where the steep decline in trust in democracy has to have a connection with violence, right? I mean, there's been an ongoing political crisis, turn of government, et cetera, but the fact that homicides have doubled in Ecuador every year since 2020. I mean, the expansion of organized crime in one of the countries that were safe until very relatively recent, that had managed to sort of build some buffer between them and Colombia and other countries affected by violence, has to be a central part of the question. And I think the results of Ecuador really sort of point at that as the core. And then just to end, so we have time for more conversations. I was really puzzled by Colombia and Mexico, because why the sharp decline in trust in democracy in Colombia? It's the country with the least trust in elections, where there's not been like one seriously contested election in decades. It has so many contradictory, for example, super high trust still on the military, even though the transitional justice system has brought to light the incredible human rights violations with the false positive in recent years. So to me, that's perhaps the strangest of the results. And I have a hypothesis, which is that Colombia is having a hangover from the 2016 election. I've not consulted with my team on this hypothesis, so I am fully speaking for myself and not for the crisis group. But I think we're seeing something similar to what happened in Colombia after the constitutional reform of 1991, which is incredible hopes on a peace agreement that people thought was going to change people's lives. And now we're seeing an increase in violence, a deterioration of the conditions for many people also in the cities because of crime. I think perhaps a little bit of disillusion with a government that people thought was going to radically change things rapidly has been chaotic, to be generous. And perhaps like a sense that these bets that we made on transforming it through a peace agreement is not working out in the way we thought. And the other country that also sort of surprises me in the opposite side is Mexico, where violence has plateaued, but at an incredibly high level, where sexual violence and gender-based violence is enormously big. I'm gonna take the opportunity to promote a report that we published yesterday on the high levels of women joining organized crime and the different layers of that. But that seems to have no impact on the trust of democracy. Support of the military, despite militarization strategy that AMLO has put forward, that has not really showed much effect. And high levels of trust on the executive, despite erosion of democratic institutions. Perhaps there's a hinting of a normalization, a sense that Mexicans think this is how it is. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Rena. I just want to say that one of my questions was exactly that Mexico is such a puzzle to me, that the trust in the executive, this issue of the militarization of law enforcement or the use of these mano dura policies, as you said, they've been so effective in El Salvador. Well, so effective and depending on what sort of way you're looking at it. But in Mexico, the military's been on the streets since Calderon, and there's been no impact when it comes to addressing this challenge. Yet trust in the armed, it's the second highest level of trust in the armed forces. El Salvador, 76%, Mexico, 66%. So, okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Manuel, who will discuss the migration element of the Americas Barometer.
Thank you. Although I will be very happy to continue the discussion that of the issues that Renata raised, because definitely I will disagree with some of the issues on El Salvador. But in any case, thank you very much again. It's really comforting to see the consistency of LAPOP research. I worked with Mitchell Seligson at the beginning of the LAPOP research, and we were jealous that USA gave them the contract to do the surveys because, you know, that was like a wealth of data, but at the same time, you know, it was great to have access to it and work through it. So, but in any case, going to the issue of migration, there are 4 issues I want to raise. One is about the data. The other one is about the novelty elements that you included on the issue of migration. This third one is about the relationship between migration and governance. And the fourth one, it's, you know, the policy issues to bring up from these discussions, because at the end of the day, as Marcela mentioned and many countries have looked at, is that you shape policy based on the data that you have at hand. And there are 3 things that you talked about or dropped in, you know, in the discussion: good governance, 2012, and Nicaragua. I'm not going to talk about them in that order, but we'll sprinkle a few things over there. Some of them that have to do with our discussions 15 years ago, perhaps. The first one on data is that definitely when we look at, you know, we try to distinguish between data and opinions and facts. And here, the facts confirm a lot of the data that you have, especially on the issue of migration. The report provides important insights on the intention to migrate, an issue that has seldom been discussed since basically 2000, and yet is a critical issue that we brought up into attention around 2006 about, you know, that we needed to take migration seriously, and no one was looking at this issue. And particularly the fact that the intention to migrate has been substantive. You know, 1 in 4 people to 1 in 2 people, or 1 in 2 households with an intention to migrate, is a worrisome problem. And it's been one that has been going on for several decades. 2012 is a critical point because of the global recession. And I point out to my colleague Claudio Loser, because it was the economic stupid. The recovery of Latin America from the global recession of 2009 took 3 years. But by that time, the weakness of the institutions was severe, and the capacity to improve economic conditions of people was way behind. People were living in 2012 on incomes of 2008. And that lagging created a greater intention to migrate. And then it compounded with a lot of the complexities that you bring up in the analysis, you know, economics, but also aspirational issues that in the modern society, I cannot live in this country, I have to go elsewhere. So you provide important elements that really confirm existing facts that we are living with, and that explain that between August 2008, August 2020, and October 2023, 9 million people have presented themselves at the US border. So this year alone is 3 million people. And that comes up with the novelty of the research that you provide, is that you try to differentiate between the likelihood and the very likelihood of whether you're less or more likely to migrate, looking at you know, 3 different variables. If you have saved money, if you have considered a time, a date, among other things. So I've been trying to figure out the right arithmetic calculation to know exactly at what point in time you're going to live. because this has been puzzling me. And it's hard because it changes from country to country. I used remittance data to measure that. And it's like, it used to be 9 months. Now it seems to be 3 months. But in any case, it's a very good indicator that really can help you. When I looked at the case of Nicaragua, the intention to migrate may be 50%. It confirms some of the other survey we've done before, but also effectively 1 in 10 people left Nicaragua this year. So it's half of what you think, what comes across as very likely, but it's, to me, it's pretty close. It's very useful. The third issue is the relationship between governance and migration. And here, I don't want to delve into the details because the data, as you presented it, is not analyzing the determinants per se of the political dimensions, but definitely when we look at the countries with the highest intention to migrate and the countries that have arrived at the US border, El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Cuba, Haiti, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Honduras, they have a lot in common. And these are politically difficult countries. Or, I won't use another word that, but they are troublesome countries, very fucked up. But in any case, the issue is really right in your face. There is definitely a fundamentally political dimension to the problems that we're dealing with the intention to migrate and with the actual immigration. Venezuela, 1 in 10 people also migrated this year. 750,000 people left this year, according to my estimates. And there is, for Mexico, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, Cuba, the last 4 years, rate of migration has been the highest in the past 30 years. So you can say something about Bukele being popular, but the fact is that when we analyze the data between the concerns of the concentration of power of Bukele and the intention to migrate, there is a positive correlation. The more concerned you are with that guy getting stronger, the more likely you are to migrate. And so you have 1% of the Salvadoran population leaving every year. And from Honduras and Guatemala, it's 2% of the population since 2018. Finally, the policy issue. Seems to me that democracy and migration are fundamentally today a foreign policy problem and one that we are not paying attention enough. Even though the State Department puts democracy as one of the foundational priorities of foreign policy, we're still a lot to see into that dimension. And especially when we look at what colleagues call in the National Security Council our policy toolbox. Well, we have agreements that these countries, these nations have broken down, agreements that have to do with the Democratic Charter, the Convention of Human Rights, the Central American Free Trade Agreement with the United States, and yet we are not enabling those tools in order to make these countries comply with those elements and reduce the intention to migrate. So there is a fundamental important issue that brings up the issue of penalties, the issue of material pressure, the issue of sanctions, the issue of further diplomatic mobilization towards making democracy back into the Americas. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our commentators. Really, really interesting and thought-provoking analysis. So I am going to, given the time, I'm going to cede my